Chapter 3: The Korean War. First, why did the USA and the UN intervene in the Korean Civil War in 1950? The first reason was American anti-communism. The US was worried for its security and thought that its capitalist views would be threatened with the rising amount of communism. The second reason is the world balance of power, and this means more communist countries could mean American capitalism is in danger, and so Americans were worried that their power as a country would decline if there were more unity with communism around the world. Reason 3 is McCarthyism and domestic political concerns. McCarthy and others pressured Truman, blaming him for loss of China, and Truman wanted to be seen as tough to the hypercritical American public. Reason 4 is the NSC 68, which means the National Security Council had recommended to build a powerful bomb, conventional forces, and defend shores, seek allies, and mobilize the public, so Truman felt that this could be achieved by involving the U.S. with the Korean War. Reason 5, fears for Japan. The U.S. freshly got Japan and wanted to revive it, so they were scared since Japan was so close to Korea that it would make Japan in danger. Reason 6, the UN and lessons from history. Because the League of Nations failed in World War II, Truman was worried the same thing would happen again with the UN if he didn't take action with the Korean War. A significant debate was why did the Korean War begin, and a lot of historians took different perspectives on it, such as Bruce Cummings, who said that it was originally a Korean War, and it was more about Korean nationalism rather than about communist threat, and that the U.S. joined because they stopped a left-wing revolution in South Korea. And a traditional view was from Michael Doctorow or Michael Hopkins, and they said that the USA was motivated by anti-communism and containment. A revisionist view was from Robert Wood, who said the U.S. was motivated by economic imperialism, and Melvin Leffler said that Japan's economic revival relied on markets from other countries, and the U.S. wanted to show Japan that they were a really great power and ally. And lastly, John Lewis Gladys said that the U.S. motivated by communist challenge and did it for the sake of the UN.
The summer and autumn of 1950. The summer and autumn of 1950 was very impactful during the Korean War. The U.S./Republic of Korea situation was often very poor, with U.S. troops having low morale and finding it difficult to find a reason to be fighting in the war, and conditions in Korea at this time were often very poor, and it just lowered morale overall. But the assault of Incheon was very powerful and impactful, where MacArthur brilliantly led an amphibious assault on Incheon, where the South Korean capital of Seoul was quickly taken. Now this switched the momentum of the war, and it switched from restoring the status quo in Korea to, quote, destroying North Korean armed forces, end quote. This led to MacArthur becoming, arrogant to say the least, and he, in October of 1950, he reversed his previous order to disallow American forces to operate near the Chinese border, and, them doing this eventually led to the intervention from China, which proved to be one of the most major downfalls for the Korean War for the U.S. Chinese entry into the war. With the reversal by MacArthur of his previous order to not operate near the Chinese border, China had no choice but to enter, as American forces stationed themselves in Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. This led to over 150,000 soldiers into North Korea by the Chinese, and the U.S., surprised by both the North Korean winter and the arrival of the many Chinese soldiers, they were in trouble, and MacArthur decided that a huge offensive would reverse this. This leads to the November offensives. The November offenses for the U.S. were disastrous. They had little success and were often more damaging than they were helpful. For China, however, they responded with their own offensive with 300,000 Chinese forces and 100,000 North Koreans, outnumbering the just 270,000 U.S., UN / Republic of Korea forces. Both sides suffered as a result, and one of the major instances of this was in Frozen Chosin, where 25,000 Americans were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese. U.S. air supremacy saved many American lives, but 6,000 were killed, wounded, or captured, and another 6,000 suffered from severe frostbite. And for the Chinese, it was much the same. There would often be fleets of men who died from frostbite and just freezing out in the cold.
Harry Truman often described the Korean War as UN police action. 40,000 troops from other nations, such as Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, and France were sent. Countries like India, Italy, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden sent medics, while countries like Chile, Cuba, Ecuador, and Iceland sent food and economic aid. Although not all Canadians were happy fighting in the Korean War, they still played an important part in the UN effort. After the USA and UK, Canada's 27,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen made up the third largest army in Korea. The historian William Stoke said that the Canadians provided counterweights to the tendencies in Washington and prevented an escalation in Korea, which could have ended in World War III.
To continue, we will next look at why the Korean War came to an end. By the end of 1951, it was clear that the American public wanted out of the war. The U.S. was suffering financially, and the war was very unpopular. MacArthur would be fired by President Truman, which decreased Chinese fears of U.S. aggression when MacArthur was dismissed. This brought in Matthew Ridgway, who would fix up the troops' morale, revitalize the army, and ensure a stalemate with the Chinese forces, once pushing them back to the 38th parallel. As mentioned before, the U.S. public were not fond of the war. Many people liked MacArthur, and when he was fired, this caused a lot of public outcry. Many supporters then wanted to impeach Truman, and this pushed the closing of the war. As mentioned before, the Chinese would no longer be fearful of the United States. It was clear towards the end of the war that Korea wanted to give up, that China was exhausted, the U.S. was exhausted, and the Soviet regime was exhausted. This led to the peace finally coming on July 27th of 1953, and in the outcome of the war, a demilitarized zone was created between the North and South on the 38th parallel. Next, we will look at the diplomatic and political outcomes of the Korean War, more specifically within internal politics and U.S. foreign policy. Back at home, with the rise of the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism, the ending of the war would lead to an intensified effect of the McCarthy era and hysteria around it. Many people would then become more fearful of communism, pushing the Cold War even further. As mentioned before, Truman had fired MacArthur, and the never-ending war hurt his presidency as well as the U.S. economy. Trying to keep out of any more wars, Truman would instead seek a containment and deterrence policy under his Truman Doctrine, which was created before the war. Korea became a turning point in the Cold War. We know that the U.S. would seek a policy of containment, where they would stop communist nations from spreading to surrounding democratic nations, which would also increase their global credibility just by a slim margin. The shift in U.S. focus would be seen from their attention towards Europe following World War II, towards Southeast Asia in seeking out new alliances with these democratic nations, again for the policy of containment. Following the Korean War, with the outing of Truman and the replacement of Eisenhower, the arms race would be kicked into high gear, as you could see an increased defense expenditure and global interventions from the United States, which would increase the military spending and funding towards nuclear warheads. And as mentioned above, increasing the focus on Asia that contributed to a further marginalization of Latin America in the U.S. foreign policy. It shows that the Korean War confirmed, or even created a U.S. tendency to militarize the Cold War struggle, reflecting in an increased military rather than economic aid to Latin American countries.